someone I know who is retired now, but I remember him as a curate in the Church of England, and he had some building work done on his house, and he rang the builders to have a rant at some stuff that went wrong. So he had a rant down the phone. He dialed the wrong number, and the person at the other end said, "Do you know who this is?" "No." "I am the Bishop of Chichester." And to which this man replied, "Well, do you know who this is?" And he said, "No." And "Good," and hung up. And it's quite funny when people miss people who think they're important. And my dad used to be a loss adjuster, so he did these insurance claims. A friend of mine worked for Nissan, and he used to sell cars or do these celebrities would use them for a weekend. And it was great when both of these people got famous people kind of going, "Do you reckon?" And they're sort of, no. It's quite funny when that happens. But sometimes it is significant, and you do need to know who you are dealing with. And to state the obvious, we particularly have to do that with Jesus. Who is he? Why did he come? What is he like? And the reason why we need to know that is often, I think what we do is we view Jesus as an idea. We talk about him as an idea, as a theory, someone or something we talk about, as if Jesus is a metaphor. And if you've come across people like Jordan Peterson and people like that, that's all very interesting, but it's like Jesus doesn't have to be real. He's a metaphor that helps us understand life. What we've seen through Mark is that Jesus is a person, that he's real. But what kind of person? So often Christians love the fact we're talking about a person and a relationship, but we can be a bit sentimental, as if he's a bit like us, a bit bigger. And many images of Jesus are like that. I heard someone say, "I can't worship a Jesus I could beat up." Maybe that's how he's portrayed sometimes. And that's what Mark is all about, and what we've been all about as we've gone through Mark. And there's a particular angle here that he takes to help us see more about Jesus. People often miss quite who Jesus is. And if you do, well, I suggest that we all do at some point, miss quite who we're talking about, you're in good company, because the 12 repeatedly do it. Now, I want us to notice in the passage that Rion read a moment ago, it is a bit weird, and we need to lean into the weird to get it. So verse 48, the disciples are finding it hard work rowing. Then Jesus walks on water to them. Verse 49, he intends to walk past them. That's a bit odd. And then verse 51, he gets in the boat. And it says, verse 52, for they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. Someone get everything on the music stand at the same time. That's just strange, isn't it? It's all strange. And it's not a rescue, is it? What did he achieve by walking up there? It's not a healing, but it is a demonstration of his identity and power and his compassion. Now, I mentioned this before, that Mark likes these sandwiches where the way he explains things to us is you have a bit of bread either side of some filling. And he does that here. And we're going to look at the filling first, which is about the identity and power of Jesus. And then we're going to look at the bread, which is, I think, why we're told this story. And it's about a crisis of doubt and how Jesus meets us at that point of crisis when we need him. So the first thing we're going to look at is the filling. You see Jesus' identity as the Redeemer God in verses 47 to 50. Now, Mark has been piling this on through his book. He gives away his conclusion, so it's no great surprise, in the first sentence of Mark. I'll read it to you again. Mark 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So the first half of the book in particular, he's showing that Jesus is the Son of God. And what does that mean? It means that Jesus has all the authority of God come in a person. And so we've already seen he has authority over people, in healing, that he puts his words as equal to God's word in the Bible. He commands the weather. He raises the dead, and he forgives sins. Things that only God can do, Jesus does. That's what it means. And last week, we looked at the feeding of the 5,000, and Jesus showed us lots of Old Testament echoes for his identity, especially from the Exodus. So he showed us then he is the Redeemer God who saves. Particularly, he shows that Jesus is the good shepherd king who feeds his flock by bread from heaven. That's what we saw last week. And also, James pointed out to us that the miracle was just to the disciples. If you'd been there, you would not have seen a miracle. Well, you would have done, but you wouldn't have known that you had. You would have thought, what a well-organized team of disciples. The disciples saw the miracle. And this is similar. Again, only they see it. Only the disciples see this. And then we're told about it. And again, like last week, there are lots of Old Testament clues. And as we go through, it builds up a bigger and bigger and clearer picture of who Jesus is. So there's 3 clues. There's 3 I've got. 3 clues. The first is that he walks on water. Not just because he can, I think. So in Old Testament wisdom, like the Psalms, and especially most clearly in the book of Job, God, who created the land and the sea, is poetically pictured as walking on the water and riding the storm. And here he is in a storm, Jesus walking on water. So there's a fairly clear hint of who he is. If that's not strange enough, the second thing is as he's walking on the water, he goes to pass them by at the end of verse 48. Now, that's strange, isn't it? That's strange. He can walk on water, and the only thing on the lake are the disciples. And he walks out, and then it walks past them. That's quite strange, as if he's lost on the lake. There's 2 very famous events in the Old Testament where God passes by. Interestingly, they don't happen on a lake. They happen on Mount Sinai or Horeb. Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah come up again in the gospel. They get as close to God as anyone else. They have a particular experience, both of them, on the mountain, where you get as close to God as anyone ever has. They have a chat with God, and he passes by. That means they have a unique revelation where they say, I want to see you. And God says, but you can't, but I will pass by. And he puts them in a safe place, and he passes by, and they see his back, but they don't see his face. And that's for their own safety, that God only allows them to see him pass by. And so here, Jesus is about to pass by, walking on the water, about to pass by, but he doesn't. He doesn't pass by. He comes in to where the disciples are. So in the past, God came so far to us, or we could come so far to him. In Jesus, he comes all the way. We can fully know God. In Jesus, we see God's face. Actually, we'll pick up a bit of that tonight. And the final clue in the filling, if we haven't got it already, is Jesus says, it is I. Don't be afraid, it is I. Now, actually, more literally, the makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about when I talk about the Greek, but literally, it is ego eimi, I am. And I think every English translation puts it is I because it's not good English, but it wasn't good Greek either. He's saying something that slightly jars grammatically. I am. It's not that he has bad grammar, though. When Moses asked God, what is your name? God answered, I am. When God sent Moses to the Hebrews, he said, tell them, I am sent you. And that's where we get the word Yahweh from. So the word Yahweh, we don't actually know how you're meant to pronounce it, but the letters would suggest it's something like Yahweh, which is the Hebrew word to be. And it comes into, so there's a German misliteration that comes into an English misspelling that's Jehovah. That's where it comes from. The word doesn't exist. So if you see Yahweh or Jehovah, it's the I am. And in our English versions, usually you see Lord in capitals. So if you see in the Old Testament Lord in lowercase, it means Lord. If you see it in capitals, it means I am. So he's saying, and because it doesn't have a tense, it means I am, I was, I will be. It means I'm existence, I am. And Jesus walks on water, passes by, says, I am. And the response of the 12 is to be amazed. It's the same Jesus. There's nothing that's changed about him, but they now see him differently, which is something we have to do sometimes, and we can be amazed. So his actions heavily point to his identity, but his words confirm it. It gets clearer as we go through. And what does that mean? It means literally he has the divine right to ask you of what he wills. He can do with you what he wills. He has absolute power. That's a terrifying thought. Indeed, that's their first response is fear, as it was when they were in the storm. But in one sense, that makes perfect sense. You know who you're dealing with. Fear the Lord. Jesus presented to us. He commands us of things, and sometimes our response is, well, I see things differently. Someone said this to me recently. The problem in the modern church is we're full of Jesus admirers. What we need is followers. Follow what he demands. He's not demanding. He has the right to do that. I might have mentioned this before. Previous church, there was a lady interested in becoming a Christian. She said, but what if God asked something of me, like to be a missionary in Africa? And normally our response is to go, well, that's not going to really happen like that, is it? But our minister said, I couldn't rule it out. And you have to go. Because he can demand stuff of us. But at the same time, notice he says, do not fear. We don't fear with him in the boat. We do not fear the one with ultimate power. If we don't fear him, there's nothing left to fear. Because he comes with ultimate power and together with ultimate goodness. Jesus is the creator God, has come into the world with complete authority. He decides the moment that life starts and ends, the speed the earth rotates at. He's not there to respond to our whims. He's not there to bring a self-help program. And yet he says, do not fear. Know who you're dealing with. And respond to him as he is, the Almighty. Now, it's interesting the different views that people have about God. And you could summarize it as the transcendent view and the immanent view. That is, that God is above and beyond and we cannot understand and know him. And the other one is that perhaps he's impersonal but very close. He's in the table, he's in the plants, he's in us. And what do we find when we meet Jesus? He is transcendent and immanent. He is above all things and above all understanding, and yet he is close and knowable and says, do not fear. That's the filling. Now, there's a bit of bread either side of that, which is why they need to be told. There's a crisis point, and you see that in verse 46 and verses 51 and 52. So 2 clues this time. The crisis, and that crisis is about doubt. So verse 46, Jesus goes up to the mountain and prays alone, and verse 51, they have their amazement, and 52, they don't understand. So the first clue is the prayer in verse 46. So Jesus goes up the mountain. So again, this is very like Moses, and there's a few echoes there. I won't go into all of them, but there's a few. But he is the one greater than Moses, and he prays. Now think about that for a moment. Jesus prayed. Now, we thought about this a few weeks ago when we looked at the Trinity. That Jesus is God, but Jesus is not the Father. But they are in this perfect union. They communicate perfectly. That's why he prays. So he sent the 12 away and he prayed. Now we know that Jesus prayed. We know he prayed a lot, and he modeled prayer to the 12, like the Lord's Prayer, for example. He said, this is how you pray. But in Mark, different to the other Gospels, Mark, only 3 times we're told Jesus prayed. Now we assume he did, we're told he did in the other Gospels, but in Mark, just 3 times Jesus prayed. And each time it's a crisis. So the start of Mark, or near the start, there's a kind of a prayer for direction and focus of ministry, that he doesn't get tempted off to this sort of miracle worker type person. End of Mark, there's a more obvious crisis in Gethsemane. And so there's we flagged up there might be a crisis here. And the second clue fills us in as to what the crisis is. With all the evidence in front of them, the disciples are amazed and don't understand. And why? Verse 52, for they did not understand the loaves. Imagine you said, well, how's the sermon this morning? I didn't understand, Darren, because I didn't understand the biscuits. It seems a bit odd at first, doesn't it? But they didn't understand the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. What's the connection? Well, they don't understand what the loaves meant from the feeding. And it comes up later in the second miracle feeding. And Jesus reminds them, he says, how many leftovers did we have with the 5,000? How many leftovers with the 4,000? Do you not understand? And the first few times you read that, you go, no. But they should, and they should get it by now. It should be obvious by now. Why did they fear the storm in chapter 4? Because they doubt Jesus' care. Jesus is proving that he's God, come as a man. How much clearer can he be? So why the crisis? End of verse 52, they did not understand the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. Now the loaves should have taught us, and this is what we saw last week, is that Jesus is the Redeemer God. He's both of those things. He is God. He can do God things. And he's the Redeemer. That is, he's the saving, the buying back, the adopter. He's providing, he's caring. And so their hearts were hardened. They don't quite get his identity, therefore don't get his power and goodness. And so this is a bit like Exodus as well. There's an Exodus echo here, but a negative one. Who has a hard heart in Exodus? It's Pharaoh. They are being Pharaoh-like, and that is a very serious crisis because it means they're not just being a bit dim. It's hopeless. And there's a moral dimension to this, which we might miss. Doubt and unbelief is not intellectual. Why does someone not believe in the gospel? Why does someone not believe in Jesus? It's not because it's like, I don't really get sums. I just didn't get maths. Some people say that. Or history dates, or other things you didn't understand. And understandably, when we doubt Jesus, it is actually a sin. Hard-heartedness is when you've made up your mind and closed off to God. And despite the miracles in front of someone, there's nothing that can convince you. And that the evidence in front of us is filtered through entrenched ideas that were already there. But notice the shocker here. Who has hearts like Pharaoh? The disciples. And we're not better. But before we despair, let's remind ourselves, Jesus prayed. And what are we told in places like Hebrews? What's Jesus doing today? He is praying for you. Comes up later in Mark that belief in Jesus requires a miracle. If you are following Jesus this morning, that was a miracle. If you didn't believe and now you do, that is a miracle. For those of you who might say, I've not seen a miracle, you're not looking very hard, because just looking around the room now is full of miracles. We're too stubborn and slow to believe at times. But Jesus, we're told, continues to pray for you. I asked a non-Christian friend once, why doesn't he believe? And he said, not enough evidence. And that's quite a common answer. But the thing that's interesting about this friend was that unlike most people, he had a lot of Christian friends. He'd been to church a lot. He'd read lots of books, more books than most Christians. And he says there's not enough evidence. And so nothing would change, I'd say, would change his mind. And I said, what evidence do you want? I said, I can't remember whether I said it or he said it. A pillar of fire. Would that really matter? Would that make you a Christian? And he went, nah. It's immoral. He'd chosen to not believe. His heart was hardened. We don't need a miracle to look at to persuade us. We need a miracle in our heart to believe. So how about us? Do you get it? Have you worked out who you are dealing with one who cares deeply for you, and also the one who walks on the water and passes by, although then he doesn't pass by, he then comes to us. You won't without a miracle. Our natural state is to be dead to Jesus. We need God to do a miracle in us to bring us to life. It's frustrating, isn't it? Sharing the good news with friends or maybe people you just come across, and we just need to keep plugging away. If you think no one is listening, I mean, when I was doing the videos a couple of times, like at Christmas and the time before that, people didn't even want to speak to me. There might be other reasons why people don't want to speak to me. But it's not necessarily that we're bad at it. It's that they are hard, like everyone else. But pray for God to do a miracle in them. Jesus has shown in his words and his works, we don't need any more information about him. Yes, we can go deeper, but we know what we need to know to respond. But we need God to do work in our hearts. And that's what Mark is doing through his gospel. That's what we're doing week by week. Take these Spirit-inspired words and show people Jesus, asking for the Spirit to open hearts. And this is the Jesus we present. People may choose to ignore him. That's between them and God. But we pray and we proclaim, and the rest is with God, with them and God. Be assured, personally, we see Jesus here. We see his identity, his power, his compassion, that he is God. He is mighty. But he's the one who says, do not fear. And he comes to you. Notice it says that they're in the middle of the lake. All this happens in the middle of the lake. But when he comes into the boat, they're then at the shore. We don't know how that happened. But it shows that he cares. You know, this is true for a lot of things, but you know the facts aren't changed by what you believe, but what you choose to believe. Jesus is God come as a man. He is returning to judge, and he offers salvation. You allow him to pass by, or invite him to come in, and ask Jesus to soften your heart that he would come in. Let's pray together.